You don't lose your self-respect because someone lied to you. You lose it when you decide that their lie is more accurate description of you than your own lived experience. What I want to do in this episode is walk you from that moment of shock when you realize that you've been misled, maybe betrayed or blindsided by someone you trusted into a different frame entirely, where the betrayal is not the headline of your life, but one chapter of your ordination story. Especially if you've been wrecked economically by the last few decades. Factories closed, industries offshored, pensions have been raided, whole towns hollowed out. And on top of that, the old comforts don't quite work anymore. Religion's been exposed in all sorts of ways. You already know about that. Community feels like very thin because your closest friends live on your phone. And even the news sounds like a reality show that doesn't really deserve your attention. So let's start where this actually hurts. When you've discovered you've been used by a manager who knew the plant was closing 6 months before you did, by a pastor who loved your tithe more than your soul, by a politician who showed up at your dinner for the photo op and never came back. The first feeling isn't wisdom, it's humiliation. You run the tape in your head and think, how did I not see it? How was I the last person to know? What does it say about me that I kept showing up, kept believing, kept giving them the best hours of my day or the deepest parts of my loyalty? Well, here's the first hard reframe. Betrayal is not evidence that you are stupid. It's just evidence you are capable of trust. And trust is a form of power. The extraction systems that gutted your town cannot manufacture that on their own. In the awakening stories that I've written, I keep coming back to that simple coffee shop, to Joe behind the counter trying to stay human in a world that's built to turn him into a machine. He's just a barista in a chain cafe, right up until he realizes how he hands someone a cup can either reinforce their sense that the world is cold and transactional, or briefly remind them that they are still a person worth looking at. Betrayal hits hardest for people like Joe, because he's actually investing presence in a world that wants him numb. When somebody like that discovers a manager or a mentor was gaming them, it shakes their whole sense of reality. If that's you, I want to name something plainly. You were not dumb for believing. You were practicing one of the few things that still works in a collapsing economy: real loyalty. What failed you wasn't your character, it was the architecture around you. There are two ways to tell the story of spending years inside broken systems. One is the victim story. I got trapped, I suffered, I escaped, now I'm recovering. The other is ordination. I went in, I learned how it really works, and I paid in blood and time. And now I understand it well enough to teach and to build something else. The facts of your life don't change because or between those two narratives. The plant's still closed. The pension is still gone. The church is still split. The person that you love still chose themselves at your expense. What changes is the role you assign yourself inside the story, and this is where self-respect starts to come back. Not in some affirmational way, but in a sober audit of what you have actually survived. If you grew up in the Midwest and watched the factory lights go out, you already understand global economics better than most pundits on TV. If you sat in a pew for 20 years and watched the gap grow between what was preached and what was lived, You already understand institutional hypocrisy and spiritual bypassing better than most theologians. If you've watched your kids or grandkids disappear into screens while entire communities moved online, you have more honest picture of loneliness than the people designing those platforms. None of that knowledge came cheap. You paid for it with your time, your nervous system, your trust. The question is whether you're going to let that tuition go to waste by telling the story as if you were just a mark, a victim, or whether you're willing to see yourself as someone who went into the rigged carnival, learned every trick, and walked out with intelligence. The house will never validate, but cannot erase. So in The Gap, one of my other books, what I've called that brutal stretch between the life you were promised and the one you actually have is not a sign that you did it wrong. It's the place where the old maps stop working. In my own life, that gap has shown up over and over. Walking into the oil business thinking I was just there to make a living, only to see up close how entire ecosystems were being sacrificed for quarterly returns. Then into finance, watching capital concentrate while the people doing the work got more precarious every year. Then into corporate transformation spaces that promised impact but rewarded compliance. Each time I gave too much trust to people and institutions that could not hold it. And each time I walked out feeling stripped, embarrassed, deeply angry at them, but ultimately mostly at myself. What finally shifted was not the systems. They're still doing what they do. What shifted was the way that I interpreted my own arc. I stopped asking, why was I so naive? And I started asking, what did this teach me that people outside the blast radius will never see? That's when self-respect actually quietly came back. Not as swagger, but as an accurate appraisal of what my own loyalty had allowed me to witness. If you've been misled or blindsided, there are 3 dignities, or you do not have to surrender, even if you lost almost everything else. First, the dignity of your attention. You decide what you stare at. If the betrayal is all you rehearse, it will colonize every corner of your day. If you start noticing the small points of honesty that are still left, a coworker who tells you the truth even when it costs them, a neighbor who quietly pays someone's light bill, or that one nurse at the midnight ER who treats you like a human being, you're not being naive again. You're deciding that your consciousness will not be fully outsourced to the worst actors in your story. Second, the dignity of your labor. You might be stacking boxes, making coffee, driving a truck, caring for kids or elders, work that the algorithm culture calls low skill because it doesn't understand what it takes to show up for other people day after day without a script. Joe learns in Awakening on Main Street that the same job that once felt like a dead end becomes a kind of dojo when he brings real attention to it. The company doesn't change, the pay doesn't double, but the sense of himself does because he stops confusing their evaluation of his role with the reality of his contribution. Third, the dignity of your interpretation. No corporation, church, influencer, or newsfeed gets to be the final narrator of your life. They can fire you, ghost you, cancel you, smear you. They cannot tell you what your years meant unless you outsource that job. The facts don't get cleaned up. You still own the mistakes you made and the ways that you played along to survive. but you stop treating your own conscience like a hostile witness. I'm not going to sell you a new belief system. You're already suspicious of anything that looks like organized certainty, and you should be. What I'm going to suggest is that what you're looking for now is not a new religion or an online community that pretends to be your family. You're looking for a way to live in a world that's of collapsing institutions that without collapsing inside yourself. In the awakening fiction, that's what the whole city is secretly doing. They don't all start a new church. They don't all move into a commune, and they don't agree on language. They quietly start practicing a different quality of attention in very ordinary places: a cafe, a construction site, a street corner with a violinist, a comedy club, community clinic. Their self-respect doesn't come from winning. It comes from alignment between what they know and what they're willing to live. If you've been betrayed, here's the most dangerous thing that can happen. You start to believe that your loyalty itself was the mistake. So you withdraw it from everything and everyone, including yourself. You numb out with distraction, rage scroll through other people's disasters, treat your own heart like a risky asset that you can't afford to invest again. That might protect you from being fooled in the short term, but it slowly erodes the very capacities you're going to need for whatever comes next: discernment, courage, solidarity. A different path looks like this. You keep your loyalty, but you raise your standards for what's worthy of it. You stop giving it away to brands or to personalities or institutions that cannot survive your questions. You start giving it to practices, people, and places where you can verify with your own senses that something real is happening. And that might be as small as a weekly conversation with one other person, where you both tell the truth about your lives without trying to fix each other. It might be as unglamorous as the way you show up to a shift that nobody else celebrates. It might be as quiet as the way you refuse to repeat a lie at work, even when everyone else has agreed to pretend. There's a scene at the end of that first awakening chapter where Joe, exhausted and doubting himself, walks over to a young artist in the corner, offers him a free espresso because he can see how present the kid is with his work. "I don't need to know what you're drawing," he says. "I can see how present you are with it. That's worth celebrating." That's what recovering your self-respect looks like after a betrayal. Not a victory lap, not a revenge fantasy fulfilled, but a quiet ability to recognize presence, first in yourself, then in others, and treat it like real currency in a world that keeps trying to pay you in illusions. So if you're sitting there with a bank account that doesn't match your effort, a body that's tired in ways that sleep doesn't fully fix, and a heart that's been wrong about the same person or some person in catastrophic ways, well, here's what I want to say as clearly as I can. You are not disqualified. You are not foolish for having loved, believed, or tried. You are exactly the kind of person history keeps underestimating until the moment everything built on lies starts to tilt. And the only person who can stand up are the ones who have already walked through the gap and refused to build their identity on the ruins. If you want to explore how this applies to your exact situation, you can use the Headroom Oracle at roachcreative.com. It's a free interactive tool built on my books, essays, and all the Transcendent videos. You bring your questions, and we walk the Q&A together using my whole body of work as the map. I'm Mark Roach. This is Transcendent, continuing to wish you all of the best.